So what was the very first prog rock album? Is there such a thing? We're going to look into it, and I'm going to give you the 25 albums that built prog rock. Greetings, salutations, respect, and love. I am Scott, and you are in the Prog Corner. And today, I'm going to be looking at the albums that created this genre that we love so much. I am of an opinion that there was no first prog album. I believe it was a continuum. I believe it was a gradual process. I'm going to go through the 25 albums that built our beloved genre. I'm doing it chronologically here, so this isn't like, what was the most important album or whatever. I'm leading all the way up. Number 25, I'm telling you right now, is in the Court of the Crimson King. So there's 24 albums before that helped build the genre. So the concept that In the Court of the Crimson King was the first prog album is a little dubious to me. So here we go. I'm going to start with In the Wee Small Hours from 1955. It's Frank Sinatra. What? How did Frank Sinatra help build prog? Well, this was the very first concept album, and as a result, it's a very important record in the history of recorded music, absolutely. Next up, I'm going all the way back to 1959, and yeah, it's over my shoulder there. It's Dave Brubeck's Time Out. Yeah, it's not prog, but it definitely got American audiences used to weird time signatures, right? Blue Rondo a la Turk and, Take Five. Those were some weird time signatures for 1959, man. Absolutely. Let's go to 1965 next. And a guy named Bob Dylan, and he releases an album named Highway 61 Revisited. It's got like a 12-minute song on there, but it's not the song like that makes Dylan important in the development of prog. It's the idea, it's the concept that popular music could actually be an art form, be taken a little bit more seriously than just the 3-minute pop song. And this was where Dylan was going all electric and having an actual band. So Highway 61 definitely deserving to be there. I could have put Blonde on Blonde on there being the first double album. Dylan, not prog, but definitely important in the development of prog. Here's another band, absolutely not prog, but people cite this album all the time as fundamental and foundational for our genre. And it's Pet Sounds, came out May 16th, 1966. And the concept of, the studio being like an additional band member kind of takes its root right here. A million people played on this album. It sounds great, and it inspired John Lennon to up their game, what they were doing over there. So definitely an important album. Also from 1966. A cat named Frank Zappa dropped his debut album, Freak Out. So we have two Californians in 1966 making a big impact on our genre. And Freak Out, wow. I mean, just crazy. Talk about so far ahead of its time. It's not even funny. Is Frank Zappa prog? Who knows? Who cares? But he's progressive through and through. And Freak Out is where it all started. Let's jump to 1967, man. One of the seminal years for the development of prog, absolutely, and it started in January with the Doors, another American act. Who says that prog was all about the UK? They're not paying attention, obviously, but the Doors, their first album, definitely, you have the classical influence, a little bit of Baroque pop thrown in there, keyboard heavy. Definitely pointing the way to a lot of stuff that proggers would be doing. Later on in 1967, a guy named Captain Beefheart put his first album out, Safe as Milk, and being a Zappa protege, I guess it makes sense that he's on this list. I probably should have put Trout Mask Replica on here, but it came out a little bit later. So we're looking at the foundational stuff, the proto-prog type of stuff. Safe as Milk is a weird album. He would get even weirder and weirder. Ry Cooder's on that album. It's pretty cool. And then you get to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which dropped in 67. Is it prog? Is it the first prog album? I think it's the first album by a really big band that pointed the way to something new and fresh. Absolutely one of the most important albums of all time. Is it prog? Probably not, but it definitely has elements of prog, and every single prog rocker worth their salt cites Sgt. Pepper as a primary influence. Let's go to August of 1967, and Pink Floyd were recording their debut album, At the same time, in the same studio as Sgt. Pepper, and yeah, the Piper at the Gates of Dawn comes out, and it's a more psychedelic affair. But what we're seeing here is a lot of the psych stuff really did help point the way to prog. Psych music kind of took you on a journey. It made you think about music in an entirely different way, kind of a transcendental experience. I could be talking about prog or psych there, right? October 1967, a cat named Arlo Guthrie puts out an album called Alice's Restaurant, and there's a sidelong epic on there, if you will. And, it's not necessarily prog in any way, shape, or form, but again, the idea of a sidelong song in the public consciousness, very, very important, getting people used to that. There's going to be another album I'll mention here in a minute that helped develop that kind of mind state even further. But we're now getting into November of 1967, and the Moody Blues dropped Days of Future Past, and allowing an orchestra to come in. It was just like a kind of like a experiment that the label wanted to do to show off their high fidelity, a rock band and an orchestra, but it turned out to be just an amazing album, and one of the foundational albums in prog, where you're taking classical, you're taking rock, you're smashing them together, and you get something brand new. At the tail end of 1967, hey, the Beatles weren't the only ones showing that a big giant band could be all experimental, and the Rolling Stones put out their Satanic Majesty's Request. It's drenched in mellotron, and it's definitely an experimental album. So when you've got both the Beatles and the Stones doing super experimental albums, it definitely helped point the way and open the door for other bands. It gave them permission, right? It gave them permission to be weird and to do odd stuff. Now we're getting into 1968, and the year began with the Zombies, Odyssey and Oracle. What a fantastic album this is. It's got mellotrons, it's got Hammond, it's got all kinds of cool harpsichords in there. This is absolutely Baroque pop, but it was a huge, huge album with the, big top 10 singles. So Americans were eating this stuff up, and we were just getting used to that sound. That psychedelic sound absolutely helped pave the way for prog. And we're going to talk about another artist right now, falls in kind of that same category. Their first album came out early in 68, but I'm going to look at their second album, which came out in June of 68. And it was dominated by a side-long epic on side 2. Yeah, we're talking about Iron Butterfly and In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. A lot of the elements of prog are right there, right? I mean, you listen to that song, everybody knows it. You mention, hey, what's a really, really long song? And about half the people on earth will answer In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. Yeah, it's not prog, but they did sell their PA system to Yes before Yes's first American tour. And the sidelong epic is just that. It is epic. It's great. Everybody knows it. And it did help open the way to long-form songwriting. Later on that same month of June 1968, Arthur Brown puts out The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. And it's just, this thing was a hit on both sides of the Atlantic. He's kind of been forgotten about here in the U.S., but definitely very important figure in the development of prog. Absolutely, yeah, you got Vincent Crane and Carl Palmer, and a lot of cool people came out of that group. So yeah, Arthur Brown. Next up, in September 1968, the very first true prog epic song came out, Procol Harum, in Held 'Twas an I off of Shine On Brightly. Just such an amazing track. Probably the first pure prog track ever recorded right there. I love it. Next up, later on in 68, Keith Emerson was not to be outdone. He had just slimmed the Nice down to a 3-piece, and they dropped their second album, Ars Longa Vita Brevis, and it is just phenomenal. What a great piece of proto-prog. Everything that you will hear later on developed in Emerson, Lake and Palmer. You hear it, the origins and the genesis of it right there. Absolutely. Here we go. We got a few things that came out in December of 1968. First off, SF Sorrow by the Pretty Things. Is this the first rock opera? Pete Townsend talks about how he'd never heard it before, but I found an interview with Pete Townsend where he actually admits that he had heard SF Sorrow, and he knew all about the Pretty Things and what they were doing. A couple months later, he'd drop Tommy. We're going to talk about that in a minute. 1968 also saw the release of the first Clouds album. This is a band that has been completely wiped off the face of the earth, but their keyboard player, Billy Ritchie, is the man who invented prog. There are articles on the internet stating that. It's probably a little overblown and hyperbolic, but the guy definitely, 123 was an absolutely important band in the development of prog. He started the band up in Scotland, but moved down to England in 66 and got a residency at the Marquee Club where everybody saw 123. Emerson saw him, Bowie saw him, Wakeman saw him. Everybody was influenced by him. Brian Epstein wanted to take him to the highest of heights, but I guess he died, and then for some reason they changed the name to Clouds, and by the time they dropped their debut album in 1968 called Scrapbook, nobody cared. What a terrible waste, man. One of the forgotten heroes of prog, Billy Ritchie and Clouds, absolutely. And then in 1968, in California, an American band called Touch put out their debut album. And the story goes that this album is so good that when John Anderson and Yes were visiting America for the first time, John heard this album and he liked it so much he bought 2 copies. Here we go, 1969. Band out of the UK called East of Eden drops Mercator Projected, a really cool record with a lot of jazz-inflected weirdness going on, a lot of horns and stuff. Very cool, kind of a forgotten band, but absolutely they were prog. May of 1969, Tommy comes out. Yeah, it's not the first rock opera, but it's the first rock opera that people heard and actually cared about. And they clearly knew a little something about concept albums from The Who Sell Out. So they used some of that in Tommy. But man, oh man, what an amazing album. I love Tommy. July 1969, In a Silent Way. Miles Davis and his band, he's got an electric band now, kind of forsaken the jazz instrumentation, going more of a what would become fusion, and fusion is prog, I don't care what you say, so Miles Davis has to be included in one of the 25 albums that built prog. And then in September 1969, Soft Machine puts out their second album, Volume 2. Their first album was a little more pure psych, but their second album, both sides, sidelong suite. It doesn't get much more prog than that, does it? And then in October 10th, 1969 to be exact, In the Court of the Crimson King comes out. And, people identify that as the very first prog album, but I've got it at number 25 on my list, so I think there are 24 albums that came before it that absolutely helped shape it. We didn't even talk about Caravan's first album, which came out before In the Court of the Crimson King. Jethro Tull's first album came out before In the Court of the Crimson King. Yes's first album came out before In the Court of the Crimson King. So much great stuff. Coliseum's first album came out before In the Court of the Crimson King. So, the idea that is the end-all and the be-all as far as the origin story of prog, absolutely wonky and not correct. So hopefully I cleared the air a little bit on that. There was no definitive starting point for prog. It was a process, right? It was a whole thing. Just like there's not going to be any definitive endpoint for prog. It's never going to die. And if I have anything to say about it anyway. So that's my wrap up of the 25 albums that built prog. I love you guys. I will see you tomorrow with more exciting prog rock content. In the meantime, you know what I'm going to say. You know exactly what's next. Peace in the Middle East, save the Ukraine, save Tibet, save the king, save everybody. I'll see you tomorrow. I love you. Peace.